The scorching sun bore down on the makeshift auction platform in Abilene, Kansas, as Clara Jenkins, the self-appointed auctioneer, raised her bony hand to silence the murmuring crowd. Bethany Evans clutched her 6-month-old son closer to her chest, trying to shield his delicate skin from the merciless July heat of 1874. The baby whimpered softly, unaware that his fate along with his mother's hung in the balance of the highest bidder. Folks, as you all know, the late William Evans left his widow with nothing but debts and a hungry mouth to feed, Clara announced, her voice carrying across the town square. Christian charity compels us to find them a suitable situation. We'll start the bidding at $5 for the pair. Bethany's cheeks burned with humiliation. 3 months ago, she had been the respectable wife of a store owner. Now, after William's sudden death from typhoid and the revelation of his gambling debts, she was being auctioned off like livestock. The town council had decided this was the most practical solution, finding her a new husband who would take responsibility for her and little Joseph. Several men stepped forward, most of them older farmers or widowers looking for a housekeeper, more than a wife. The bidding climbed slowly to $12, then $15. $18, called out Harold Simmons, a man known for his mean temper and wandering hands. Bethany shuddered, pulling Joseph even closer. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle. Some women watched with pity in their eyes, while others seemed almost pleased by her downfall. Bethany had never quite fit in since arriving in Abilene 2 years earlier, her Eastern education and refined manners setting her apart. $20, offered George Pearson, a rancher in his 60s whose 3 previous wives had all died under suspicious circumstances. Clara Jenkins smiled thinly. $20 for this fine young woman and her healthy baby boy. Do I hear 25? As the bidding continued, dust rose from the east end of Main Street. A lone rider approached at a steady pace, seemingly unbothered by the summer heat. Few noticed him at first, attention fixed on the macabre auction taking place. $28, came a new bid from Frank Wilson, the saloon owner who had made no secret of his interest in Bethany even while William was alive. Clara nodded. $28, going once. The horse and rider drew closer, going twice. The stranger pulled his mount to a stop at the edge of the crowd. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. A worn leather duster covered his frame, and a gun belt hung low on his hips. "Sold to $100, called a deep voice from the edge of the gathering. The crowd parted as the rider dismounted and approached the platform. His boots kicked up dust as he walked, spurs jingling with each deliberate step. He stopped at the foot of the platform, looking up at Bethany with startlingly blue eyes. "I said $100, he repeated. "For the widow and her child." Clara's mouth hung open. "Sir, the bidding was at 28, I heard." He pulled a leather pouch from his coat and tossed it onto the platform. Gold coins spilled out, glinting in the sunlight. "There's your 100. I'll take them." Bethany stared at the stranger, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who was this man? Why would he pay such an exorbitant sum? Joseph squirmed in her arms, perhaps sensing her anxiety. The stranger's gaze never left her face. "Name's Thomas Zachary, madam. I've got a ranch 10 miles outside of town. It's not much, but it's shelter." Clara recovered her composure and quickly counted the money. "Well, it seems we have a winner, Mr. Zachary. They're yours." Thomas nodded once, then extended his hand toward Bethany. "Mrs. Evans, if you'll come with me." Bethany hesitated, scanning the crowd for any sign of help. But the faces that met hers showed only relief that they wouldn't have to worry about her and her baby any longer. With a deep breath, she descended the steps, her legs trembling beneath her. "I have some things at the boarding house," she said quietly as she approached the stranger. "We'll get them," Thomas replied, his voice gentler than before. He turned to his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, and adjusted the saddle. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Bethany answered, though it had been years since she'd been on horseback. Without another word, Thomas lifted her onto the saddle, carefully supporting Joseph as he did so. The baby had gone silent, staring with wide eyes at the unfamiliar man. Once they were settled, Thomas took the reins and led the horse toward the boarding house where Bethany had been staying since losing her home. The townsfolk watched them go, already beginning to gossip about the mysterious cowboy who had paid a fortune for a widow and her baby. Bethany felt their eyes on her back, but refused to look behind. Whatever fate awaited her with this stranger, it had to be better than being sold to someone like Harold Simmons or George Pearson. At the boarding house, Thomas waited outside while Bethany gathered her meager belongings. She had little left: a carpet bag with some clothes, a silver hairbrush that had been her mother's, William's pocket watch, and a small wooden box containing Joseph's birth certificate and her marriage license. When she emerged, Thomas was speaking quietly to his horse, stroking its neck. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "That's all?" he asked, nodding at her bag. "Yes," she replied, holding Joseph in one arm and the carpet bag in the other. Thomas took the bag from her and secured it to the saddle. Then, with surprising gentleness, he lifted Bethany and the baby onto the horse again. "It's a long ride," he warned. "Hold on tight." This time he swung up behind her, his chest solid against her back. His arms came around her to grasp the reins, creating a secure barrier that kept both her and Joseph from falling. Despite her apprehension, Bethany found herself relaxing slightly against him as they rode out of town. The Kansas plains stretched before them, golden in the late afternoon light. They rode in silence for the first mile, the only sounds being the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and Joseph's occasional coos. Finally, Bethany found her voice. "Why did you do it, Mr. Zachary? Why pay so much?" Thomas was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice rumbled against her back. "No one should be auctioned off like property," he said simply, "especially not a mother and child. But $100. It's just money." Bethany twisted slightly to look up at his face. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows, but she could see the firm set of his jaw and the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years in the open air. "What do you expect of me?" she asked directly, needing to know her position. "What will my duties be?" Thomas met her gaze briefly before returning his attention to the trail ahead. "You'll have your own room, the baby too. There's cooking and cleaning if you're willing. The ranch isn't big, just me and two hands, but I don't expect anything improper." Relief washed through her, though she remained cautious. Men's words and actions didn't always align, as she had learned during her marriage to William. Her late husband had been charming during their courtship in St. Louis, promising her a wonderful life in the West. The reality had been far different: a small, struggling store, mounting debts, and William's growing resentment toward her and later their child. "Thank you," she said quietly, not knowing what else to say. They rode on as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Joseph fell asleep against her chest, lulled by the motion of the horse. Bethany, too, found herself growing drowsy, the emotional exhaustion of the day catching up with her. "You can lean back," Thomas said, seeming to notice her fatigue. "I won't let you fall." Hesitantly, Bethany allowed herself to rest more fully against him. His body was warm and solid, a stark contrast to William's slighter frame. She tried to stay alert, to memorize their route in case she needed to find her way back to town, but the rhythmic movement and her own exhaustion soon overcame her. She awoke with a start when the horse slowed. Opening her eyes, she saw they had arrived at a modest ranch. A main house stood in the center, built of sturdy logs with a covered porch. To one side was a barn and corral, and on the other, a smaller cabin. Lamplight glowed from the main house's windows, casting a welcoming glow in the gathering dusk. "Home," Thomas said simply, bringing the horse to a stop before the main house. Before Bethany could respond, the front door opened and a middle-aged woman stepped out onto the porch. She was round-faced and pleasant-looking, with gray streaked black hair pulled into a bun. "Thomas Zachary." "We weren't expecting you back until—" The woman stopped abruptly, noticing Bethany and the baby. "Oh my goodness!" Thomas dismounted and reached up to help Bethany down. "Mrs. Ortega, this is Mrs. Evans and her son. They'll be staying with us." Mrs. Ortega's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline, but she quickly composed herself and bustled forward. "Well, you must be exhausted, dear. Come inside, come inside. I've just made supper." Bethany allowed herself to be ushered into the house, Joseph now awake and blinking in the lamplight. The interior was simple but comfortable, far more so than she had expected. A large main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace at one end and a sturdy table at the other. 2 doors led off the main room, presumably to bedrooms. "Thomas, you take her things to the spare room," Mrs. Ortega directed. "Mrs. Evans, please sit down. You look ready to drop." Bethany sank gratefully into a chair at the table, still trying to process the rapid change in her circumstances. Just hours ago, she had been facing the prospect of being sold to the highest bidder in Abilene. Now she was in a strange man's home, being fussed over by his housekeeper. Mrs. Ortega placed a bowl of stew in front of her, along with a thick slice of bread. "Eat, dear. I'll hold the little one while you do." After a moment's hesitation, Bethany handed Joseph to the older woman, who immediately began cooing at him. The baby, usually wary of strangers, seemed content in Mrs. Ortega's experienced hands. Thomas returned from the bedroom and hung his hat on a peg by the door. In the full light of the house, Bethany could see him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt. His face was tanned from the sun, with those striking blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. "I'll go see to the horses," he said, heading back toward the door. "Thomas Zachary, you sit down and eat first," Mrs. Ortega commanded. "Miguel can see to the horses." A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "Yes, madam." He took a seat across from Bethany and nodded toward the stew. "Mrs. Ortega's cooking is the best in 3 counties. The housekeeper huffed at the compliment but looked pleased nonetheless. She settled into a rocking chair with Joseph, speaking to him softly in Spanish. Bethany ate slowly, savoring the rich stew. It had been weeks since she'd had a proper meal, subsisting mostly on whatever the boarding house provided or what she could afford with her rapidly dwindling funds. "Mrs. Ortega lives in the cabin with her husband, Miguel," Thomas explained as they ate. "They've been with me since I started the ranch 5 years ago. Miguel handles the horses and Mrs. Ortega," he gestured to the stew, "keeps us from starving." "I see," Bethany replied, trying to understand the household dynamics. "And the other hand you mentioned, Pete Jackson. He stays in the bunkhouse behind the barn when he's not out with the herd. Good man." They lapsed into silence again. Bethany finished her stew and pushed the bowl away, feeling more herself with food in her stomach. "Mr. Zachary," she began, "I appreciate what you did today, but I need to understand my position here. Am I your employee, your ward?" She couldn't bring herself to say wife, though that was the implication of the auction. Thomas set down his spoon and regarded her steadily. "You're free to do as you please, Mrs. Evans. I bought you out of that situation, not into another one. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. If you want to stay, there's honest work and a roof over your head." From the rocking chair, Mrs. Ortega clicked her tongue. "Thomas, the poor woman has had a terrible day. Let her rest before bombarding her with decisions." Thomas nodded, looking slightly abashed. "Of course. I apologize, Mrs. Evans." "Bethany," she said, "if we're to live under the same roof, you might as well use my given name." "Bethany," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. "And you should call me Thomas." Joseph began to fuss in Mrs. Ortega's arms, and Bethany rose to take him. "He's probably hungry. If you could show me to our room." Thomas stood immediately. "Of course. This way." He led her to one of the doors off the main room. Inside was a simple but clean bedroom with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a rocking chair by the window. Her carpetbag had been placed at the foot of the bed. "The washroom is through that door," Thomas said, pointing to another door within the bedroom. "It's not fancy, but there's a pump for water." Bethany nodded, surprised by the relative luxury. Many frontier homes had no indoor facilities at all. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. Thomas lingered in the doorway for a moment. "If you need anything else, my room is across the hall. Mrs. Ortega will be here in the morning to help with breakfast." With that, he closed the door, leaving Bethany alone with her son for the first time since the auction. She sat heavily on the edge of the bed, cradling Joseph as he began to cry in earnest. "Shh, little one," she whispered, unbuttoning her dress to feed him. "We're safe for now. We're safe." As Joseph nursed, Bethany tried to make sense of her situation. Thomas Zachary seemed honorable enough, but she had been fooled by a man's outward appearance before. Still, he had saved her from a terrible fate in Abilene, and for that she owed him her gratitude, if nothing else. Once Joseph was fed and changed, Bethany laid him in the center of the bed, surrounding him with pillows to prevent him from rolling off. Then she unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and placing her mother's hairbrush on the dresser. The familiar routine gave her a small sense of normalcy in the midst of chaos. Finally, exhausted, she changed into her nightgown and slipped into bed beside her sleeping son. Despite her uncertainty about the future, Bethany fell into the deepest sleep she'd had in months. She awoke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon. Joseph was still asleep beside her, his little face peaceful in repose. For a moment, Bethany lay still, orienting herself to her new surroundings. The events of the previous day came rushing back, and with them, a mix of emotions: relief, uncertainty, and a strange sense of possibility. After dressing quickly and tending to Joseph, Bethany ventured into the main room. Mrs. Ortega was at the stove, stirring something in a large pot, while Thomas sat at the table looking over some papers. "Good morning," Bethany said, feeling awkward, both heads turned toward her. Mrs. Ortega beamed while Thomas stood, his expression softening slightly at the sight of Joseph in Bethany's arms. "Good morning," he replied. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you. Better than I have in a long time." Mrs. Ortega bustled over, wiping her hands on her apron. "Let me take this little angel while you eat. The men have already had their breakfast, but I saved plenty for you." Bethany hesitated only briefly before handing Joseph over. The older woman clearly adored children, and Joseph seemed equally taken with her, reaching for her gray-streaked hair with curious fingers. Thomas gestured to the chair across from his. "Please, sit." Bethany sat and accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Ortega poured for her. It was strong and hot, exactly what she needed. A plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits appeared before her, and her stomach growled in response. I need to head out to check on the herd, Thomas said as she ate. But before I go, I wanted to make sure you're comfortable. If there's anything you need from town, make a list. Miguel will be going in tomorrow. That's very kind, Bethany replied, still somewhat guarded. May I ask, what exactly do you expect me to do here? You mentioned cooking and cleaning, but Mrs. Ortega seems to have that well in hand. Mrs. Ortega chuckled from the rocking chair. Oh, I've been telling Thomas for months that I need help. I'm not as young as I used to be, and with spring roundup coming, there will be extra hands to feed. Thomas nodded. Mrs. Ortega has been trying to do too much. Having you here would be a great help to her if you're willing. It was a reasonable request, far more so than Bethany had feared. Of course, she agreed. I'm a fair cook, though perhaps not up to Mrs. Ortega's standards, and I certainly know how to clean. Good, Thomas said, seeming relieved. We'll work out the details of your wages later. Wages? Bethany couldn't hide her surprise. For your work, Thomas clarified. Did you think I expected you to labor for nothing? Before she could answer, the door opened and a young man stuck his head in. Boss, Pete's back from the north pasture. Says there's trouble with the fence line. Thomas stood immediately, gathering his papers. Tell him I'll be right there. He turned to Bethany. I'm sorry to cut this short. We'll talk more this evening. With that, he grabbed his hat and was gone, leaving Bethany staring after him in bewilderment. Mrs. Ortega laughed softly. That's Thomas for you. Always rushing from one thing to the next. But he's a good man, Mrs. Evans. The best I know. Bethany sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Please call me Bethany. And, would you tell me about him? About Thomas? I know almost nothing about the man who bought me and my son. The older woman settled more comfortably in the rocking chair, adjusting Joseph in her arms. Well, Thomas came to Kansas about 5 years ago. Bought this land when nobody thought it would amount to much. He was right and they were wrong. There was pride in her voice. He built this place up from nothing, worked harder than any two men, never complains, never raises his voice even when things go wrong. Where did he come from before Kansas? Bethany asked. Mrs. Ortega's expression grew more serious. Texas, I believe, but he doesn't talk much about before. I know he fought in the war, the Confederate side. Sometimes he has nightmares. She lowered her voice, though they were alone in the house. And I think he lost someone. A wife, maybe. He keeps a locket in his dresser drawer. I saw it once when I was putting away his clean shirts. But I've never asked, and he's never said. Bethany absorbed this information, trying to piece together the puzzle that was Thomas Zachary. A former Confederate soldier with a possible tragic past who now ran a successful ranch in Kansas. And who, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, had paid an exorbitant sum to save a widow and her baby from a public auction. What about his family? She asked. None that I know of, Mrs. Ortega replied. No visitors, no letters. She stood, handing Joseph back to Bethany. But enough gossip. Let me show you around the house and then we can start on the bread for tonight. The men work up quite an appetite. The rest of the day passed quickly as Bethany familiarized herself with the ranch house and its routines. Mrs. Ortega was a patient teacher, showing her where everything was kept and explaining how things were done. By mid-afternoon, they had prepared a hearty stew for supper and baked 2 loaves of bread. You're a natural, Mrs. Ortega approved as Bethany kneaded the dough with practiced hands. Where did you learn to cook? My mother taught me the basics, Bethany replied, enjoying the familiar task. But I refined my skills after marrying William. We couldn't afford a servant, so I did everything myself. Mrs. Ortega nodded sympathetically. And your husband? What happened to him, if you don't mind my asking? Bethany's hand stilled momentarily. Typhoid, 3 months ago. He wasn't a well man even before that. He had debts, many debts. When he died, I lost everything, our store, our home. The bank took it all. She resumed kneading, working out her emotions through the dough. I had nowhere to go, no family to turn to, the town council. Her voice faltered. Well, you know what happened yesterday. Dios mío, Mrs. Ortega murmured, crossing herself. What a terrible thing to do to a young mother. In my country, family would take care of you, not sell you like cattle. I have no family left, Bethany said quietly. My parents died years ago, and I was an only child. Mrs. Ortega patted her arm with a flour-covered hand. Well, now you have us. Me and Miguel, at least, and Thomas. Thomas will do right by you, you'll see. Bethany wasn't sure what doing right by her would entail, but she was grateful for the woman's kindness. As they worked, Joseph napped in a makeshift cradle that Miguel had brought over from the cabin, a wooden box lined with soft blankets. Bethany checked on him frequently, still unable to believe how dramatically their circumstances had changed in just 24 hours. The men returned as the sun was setting, bringing with them the sounds and smells of a long day's work. Miguel came in first, his weathered face lighting up at the sight of his wife. He was followed by Pete Jackson, a lanky young man with a shock of red hair, and finally Thomas, looking tired but satisfied. Something smells amazing, Pete declared, hanging his hat by the door. He noticed Bethany and touched the brim of an imaginary hat in greeting. Madam, Pete, this is Mrs. Evans, Thomas introduced. She and her son will be staying with us. If Pete was curious about the sudden appearance of a woman and baby on the ranch, he didn't show it. He simply nodded politely and went to wash his hands at the basin. Supper was a livelier affair than Bethany had expected. The men were hungry and appreciative of the meal, and conversation flowed easily, mostly about the day's work, cattle prices, and plans for the spring roundup. Bethany said little, content to observe the dynamics of the household. Joseph sat on her lap, wide-eyed at all the new faces and occasionally reaching for bits of bread that Bethany allowed him to gum. He's teething, she explained when Thomas noticed Joseph chewing intently on a crust. The bread seems to soothe his gums. Thomas nodded, watching the baby with an expression Bethany couldn't quite decipher. How old is he? 6 months, almost 7. He was born just before Christmas. He's a fine-looking boy, Thomas said. Takes after his mother. The compliment caught Bethany off guard, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. Thank you, she managed, focusing her attention back on Joseph. After supper, Miguel and Mrs. Ortega returned to their cabin, and Pete headed to the bunkhouse, leaving Bethany alone with Thomas. She rose to clear the table, but he waved her back to her seat. Sit, please. We need to talk. Bethany sat, adjusting Joseph on her lap. The baby was growing drowsy, his head lolling against her shoulder. Thomas poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her. I owe you a proper explanation, he began, his voice low and measured. About yesterday, about why I did what I did. I've been wondering, Bethany admitted. Thomas stared into his coffee for a moment before meeting her eyes. I was in Abilene on business, selling some cattle and picking up supplies. I wasn't planning to stay long, but when I rode into town and saw that auction. His jaw tightened. I've seen some ugly things in my life, Mrs. Evans, Bethany, but that was among the worst. Selling a woman and her child like property. But why me? Bethany pressed. Why spend so much money on strangers? Thomas was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, my sister was widowed young during the war. Her husband was killed at Antietam. She had a baby just a few months old. His eyes grew distant with memory. She had no one to turn to. Our parents were gone, and I was away fighting by the time I got word and could go to her. He shook his head. It was too late. She died of fever and the baby with her. I'm so sorry, Bethany whispered, understanding now his motivation. "When I saw you standing there, holding your son, looking so much like Sarah must have." He cleared his throat. "I couldn't ride away. I couldn't let what happened to my sister happen to you." The raw honesty in his voice moved Bethany deeply. "Thank you," she said, meaning it with all her heart, "for saving us." Thomas nodded, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "As I said before, you're not obligated to stay. If you decide this isn't where you want to be, I'll give you enough money to make a fresh start somewhere else. And if I stay, then you'll have a home here for as long as you want one. You'll earn your keep by helping Mrs. Ortega, as we discussed. Your son will have a safe place to grow up." He hesitated. "In time, if you wish, we could make a more permanent arrangement, but there's no rush for that decision." Bethany understood what he was offering: marriage eventually. The prospect should have alarmed her, given how little she knew him, but strangely, it didn't. There was something solid and trustworthy about Thomas Zachary, despite his reticence. "I'd like to stay," she said after a moment's consideration. "At least for now. Joseph and I have nowhere else to go, and you've been more than kind." Relief flickered across Thomas's face. "Good, that's good." He rose from the table. "It's getting late and you look tired. We can talk more another time." Bethany stood as well, Joseph now fast asleep against her shoulder. "Good night, Thomas, and thank you again." He nodded, his eyes lingering on her face. "Good night, Bethany." The next few weeks fell into a pattern as Bethany adjusted to life on the ranch. Each morning she rose early to help Mrs. Ortega prepare breakfast for the men before they headed out to work. Then came cleaning, laundry, baking, and preparing the midday and evening meals. Joseph spent much of his time in his improvised cradle or on a blanket on the floor, watched over by whichever woman wasn't busy at the moment. Miguel proved to be as kind as his wife, often bringing small toys he had whittled for Joseph. Pete, too, took a liking to the baby, making faces that sent Joseph into fits of giggles. Even Thomas, for all his reserve, would sometimes sit with Joseph in the evenings, letting the baby grip his calloused fingers or bounce on his knee. Bethany found herself watching these interactions with a warmth she hadn't expected. After William's indifference toward their son, he had wanted a daughter, and made no secret of his disappointment. It was touching to see these rough men so gentle with her baby. As for Thomas, he remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite and considerate, making sure she had everything she needed and often asking after her comfort. But he kept a certain distance, retiring to his room early most evenings or sitting on the porch alone after supper. One evening in late April, about a month after their arrival at the ranch, Bethany stepped onto the porch after putting Joseph to bed. Thomas sat in a wooden chair, whittling a small piece of wood with a pocket knife. He looked up as she approached. "Joseph is asleep?" he asked. "Finally," Bethany replied with a small smile. "He fought it tonight. I think he's starting to understand that interesting things happen after he goes to bed." Thomas chuckled, a rare sound that Bethany had come to treasure. "Smart boy." She sat in the chair beside him, enjoying the cool evening air after the warmth of the house. Spring had fully arrived, bringing with it wildflowers and new grass across the plains. The ranch was beautiful in this season, alive with possibility. "What are you making?" she asked, nodding toward the piece of wood in his hands. "A horse," Thomas replied, holding it up for her inspection. It was small but intricately detailed, the flowing mane and powerful legs clearly visible despite its unfinished state. "For Joseph, when he's a bit older." The gesture touched Bethany deeply. "That's very thoughtful. He'll love it." They sat in companionable silence for a while, Thomas returning to his carving while Bethany gazed out at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. There was a peace here that she had rarely known, a sense of safety that had been absent from her life for so long. "Thomas," she said eventually, "I've been meaning to ask you something." He looked up, his knife pausing mid-stroke. "What's that?" "Mrs. Ortega mentioned that you were in the war. That you fought for the Confederacy." Thomas's expression closed slightly, but he nodded. "I did, not something I'm proud of these days. I was just wondering, why did you leave Texas? Why come to Kansas?" He set down the carving and knife, his gaze moving out to the darkened landscape. "After the war, Texas wasn't the same. Neither was I. Too many memories, too many ghosts." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was quieter. "I needed a fresh start, somewhere I could build something new without the shadow of the past hanging over me." Bethany understood that feeling all too well. "That's why I agreed to come west with William," she admitted. "My parents had died, and St. Louis held too many painful memories. I thought a new place would mean a new beginning. And it wasn't," she shook her head. "William changed once we were married. Or perhaps he simply revealed his true nature. He was bitter, angry at the world for not giving him what he felt he deserved. He gambled, hoping for the big win that would solve all our problems." She twisted her hands in her lap. "When I told him I was expecting Joseph, he was furious, said we couldn't afford a child. She hesitated. He wanted me to get rid of the baby." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry you had to endure that." "I refused, of course," Bethany continued. "After Joseph was born, William barely acknowledged him. When the typhoid came through town, I nursed William as best I could, but he was already weakened from drinking and poor nutrition." She sighed. "After he died, I discovered just how deep his debts were. The bank took everything, even my wedding ring." "And the town turned its back on you," Thomas concluded grimly. "They never liked me much anyway," Bethany said with a small, sad smile. "I was too educated, too Eastern for their tastes." And William had borrowed money from half the businessmen in Abilene. Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was resolute. "What happened to you wasn't right. No matter what your husband did, you and your son deserved better." "We got better," Bethany said softly, meeting his eyes. "Thanks to you." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening, a warming that made Bethany's heart beat faster. For a breathless moment, she thought he might reach for her hand or say something more personal. Instead, he cleared his throat and stood. "It's getting late," he said. "And tomorrow's an early start. Spring roundup begins." Bethany stood as well, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course. Good night, Thomas." "Good night, Bethany." As she returned to her room, Bethany reflected on their conversation. It was the most Thomas had ever revealed about himself, and she felt as though she had glimpsed beneath his reserved exterior to the man beneath a man who carried the weight of the past, but still strove to do what was right. A man who had saved her and Joseph out of compassion and a desire to prevent history from repeating itself. A man, she was beginning to realize, who stirred feelings in her that she had thought long dead. The spring roundup brought chaos to the ranch. Extra hands were hired to help gather the cattle scattered across Thomas's land, count them, brand the new calves, and prepare the herd for the summer grazing season. The house was filled with hungry men at mealtimes, and Bethany and Mrs. Ortega worked from dawn to dusk cooking, cleaning, and keeping up with the increased demands. Despite the exhaustion, Bethany enjoyed the activity. The ranch hands were respectful, if rough around the edges, and she found herself smiling more than she had in years. Joseph thrived in the bustling environment, growing plumper and more curious by the day. She saw little of Thomas during this time. He was out with the men from first light until after dark, returning only to eat quickly before falling into bed. When their paths did cross, he would ask after her welfare and Joseph's, but there was no opportunity for the kind of personal conversation they had shared on the porch. One evening, about 2 weeks into the roundup, Thomas returned earlier than usual. Bethany was in the kitchen, preparing biscuits for the next morning's breakfast, while Joseph played with a wooden spoon on the floor nearby. "You're back early," she said in surprise when Thomas entered. "Finished the south pasture ahead of schedule," he replied, removing his hat and running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Thought I'd check in on things here." "Everything's fine," Bethany assured him. "Supper's almost ready, but the men aren't expected back for another hour." Thomas nodded, his eyes moving to Joseph, who had spotted him and was waving the spoon enthusiastically. A smile touched his lips. "He's growing fast." "Too fast," Bethany agreed. "He'll be crawling any day now." Thomas crouched down to Joseph's level, and the baby immediately began scooting across the floor toward him, eager for attention. When he reached Thomas's boots, he pulled himself up to a sitting position and offered the spoon with a solemn expression. "Thank you, Joseph," Thomas said gravely, accepting the gift. "That's very generous of you." Bethany watched the interaction with a warm feeling in her chest. Joseph had never known his father's love, but here was a man who treated him with genuine affection and respect, even at such a young age. "He likes you," she observed. Thomas glanced up, a touch of color rising in his tan cheeks. "He's a good boy." "Yes, he is." Bethany wiped her hands on her apron. "Would you like some coffee? It's fresh." "I'd appreciate that." She poured him a cup and brought it to the table, where he had seated himself with Joseph now on his knee. The baby was fascinated by Thomas's bandana, tugging at the faded red fabric with curious fingers. "Careful there, partner," Thomas said, gently disentangling Joseph's grip. "That's not for eating." Bethany sat across from them, taking a rare moment of rest before the evening rush began. "How much longer will the roundup last?" "Another week, maybe less if the weather holds." Thomas sipped his coffee. "Then things will settle down again." She nodded, oddly disappointed by the prospect. The bustle of the roundup had been exhausting but exhilarating, giving her a sense of purpose and contribution she had missed. "Bethany," Thomas said suddenly, setting down his cup, "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." Her heart skipped a beat at his serious tone. "Yes, Pete will be leaving after the roundup. He's got family in Colorado he wants to be near." "Oh," Bethany said, surprised. "I'm sorry to hear that. He's a good worker." "He is," Thomas agreed, "and he'll be hard to replace." "But that's not why I wanted to talk to you." He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "With Pete gone, we'll have room in the budget for improvements. To the house, I mean." Bethany looked around the main room, puzzled. The house was simple but sturdy and well-maintained. "Improvements." "An addition," Thomas clarified. "Another bedroom. For Joseph. He's getting bigger and you'll both need your space as he grows." The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught Bethany off guard. "Thomas, that's very kind, but it's not necessary. Joseph can stay with me for some time yet." "I know," he said, "but I want you both to feel that this is your home, not just a temporary arrangement." Home. The word resonated within Bethany in a way she hadn't expected. This place, this ranch, with its simple routines and honest work, had begun to feel like home in a way that neither St. Louis nor Abilene ever had. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a great deal to me." Thomas met her eyes, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had put into words. Joseph broke the moment by launching himself forward to grab at Thomas's coffee cup, nearly toppling off his knee in the process. "Whoa there, little man," Thomas laughed, catching him securely. "That's not for babies." Bethany smiled, rising to take Joseph. "I should feed him before the men arrive for supper. He gets cranky if his routine is disrupted." Thomas handed the baby over, their hands brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact, slight as it was, sent a flutter through Bethany's stomach. "I'll wash up," Thomas said, standing. "And then I can help with supper if you'd like." "I'd like that very much," Bethany replied, realizing as she said it how true it was. The spring roundup ended successfully, with a healthy herd counted and ready for the summer grazing season. The extra hands departed, leaving the ranch quieter and less crowded. Pete Jackson said his goodbyes, promising to write when he settled in Colorado. True to his word, Thomas began work on the addition to the house almost immediately. He hired a carpenter from Abilene to help with the construction, and together they worked in the evenings and on Sundays when the ranch work was less demanding. Bethany watched the addition take shape with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. Thomas had not repeated his suggestion of a permanent arrangement, but his actions spoke volumes. He was building not just a room for Joseph, but a future for all of them. One Sunday in late May, Bethany decided to prepare a special dinner to thank Thomas for all he had done. Mrs. Ortega had the day off to visit relatives in a neighboring town, so Bethany had the kitchen to herself. She prepared Thomas's favorite foods: roast beef, potatoes, and apple pie for dessert. Joseph, now nearly 8 months old, sat in a wooden high chair that Miguel had made for him, happily mashing bits of bread and potato between his fingers. Bethany had just taken the pie from the oven when Thomas entered, smelling of sawdust and fresh air. "Something smells amazing," he said, hanging his hat by the door. Bethany smiled, feeling oddly shy. "I thought you deserved a special meal with all the extra work you've been doing." Thomas's eyes softened as they moved from her to the set table and back again. Thank you." "Go wash up," she directed. "It's nearly ready." When they sat down to eat, Bethany was struck by how comfortable it felt, like a real family dinner. Joseph babbled happily from his high chair, occasionally throwing food with impressive accuracy. Thomas didn't seem to mind when a piece of potato landed on his shoulder, simply brushing it off with a laugh. "He's got a good arm," he observed. "Might make a fine baseball player someday." "Or a troublemaker," Bethany replied with mock severity, though she couldn't hide her smile. "Joseph, be polite. Thomas is building you a beautiful room after all. Speaking of which," Thomas said, cutting into his roast beef, "the carpenter thinks we'll be finished by next weekend. The plastering is done and the paint should be dry in a few days." "That's wonderful," Bethany said. "Though I admit I'll miss having Joseph beside me at night. I've grown used to his little snores." "He can still stay with you until you're both ready," Thomas assured her. "There's no rush." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds being Joseph's occasional babbling and the clink of silverware against plates. Bethany found herself studying Thomas's face, the strong lines of his jaw, the way the evening light caught in his dark hair, the tiny crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled at something Joseph did. "Bethany," Thomas said suddenly, setting down his fork. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you." Her heart quickened at his serious tone. "Yes. It's been nearly 2 months since you and Joseph came to the ranch. I hope you've been comfortable here." "More than comfortable," Bethany replied honestly. "Thomas, you've given us a home when we had none. You've been incredibly kind and generous." He looked down at his plate, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've grown, accustomed to having you both here, more than accustomed. It's hard to remember what it was like before." Bethany's breath caught in her throat. "I feel the same way." Thomas met her eyes then, and the emotion she saw in his gaze made her heart race. "What I'm trying to say, not very well, is that I care for you, Bethany, for you and Joseph. And I'd like to make our arrangement permanent if you're willing." "Permanent," Bethany echoed, wanting to be sure of his meaning. "Marriage," Thomas clarified, a flush rising beneath his tan. "I'm asking if you'd consider becoming my wife." Though she had half expected it, the proposal still took her breath away. "Thomas, you don't have to answer now," he added quickly. "I know it hasn't been long and your first marriage wasn't ideal. I understand if you need time to—" "Yes," Bethany interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. Thomas stared at her. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you," she smiled, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "I care for you too, Thomas, more than I thought possible after William. You're a good, honorable man, and you've been so wonderful with Joseph." Thomas reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I can't promise to be perfect," he said quietly, "but I swear I'll always treat you and Joseph with respect and kindness. I'll do everything in my power to make you happy." "I know you will," Bethany replied, squeezing his hand. "That's why I'm saying yes." Joseph chose that moment to slam his spoon against his tray with particular enthusiasm, as if offering his own approval of the arrangement. They both laughed, breaking the intensity of the moment. "I think that's a yes from Joseph too," Bethany said, wiping a bit of potato from her son's chin. Thomas's smile was wider than she had ever seen it. Smart boy, just like his mother. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through the area. Mrs. Ortega decorated the house with wildflowers from the prairie, and Miguel slaughtered a pig for the feast that followed. The guest list was small, just the Ortegas, a few neighboring ranchers, and the carpenter who had worked on the addition and had become a friend to Thomas. Bethany wore a new blue dress that Thomas had insisted on buying for her when they went into Abilene to get the marriage license. It was the finest thing she had owned since coming west, and she felt almost like her old self in it, the educated young woman from St. Louis, full of hopes and dreams. Joseph, dressed in a tiny new shirt and pants, was passed from guest to guest during the celebration, charming everyone with his recently mastered ability to wave goodbye and his 4 new teeth, which he showed off at every opportunity. As evening fell, the guests departed, and Mrs. Ortega took Joseph back to the cabin with her, insisting that the newlyweds deserved a night to themselves. Bethany found herself alone with Thomas, her husband, for the first time since the ceremony. "Are you happy?" he asked, coming to stand beside her on the porch where she had retreated to catch her breath after the day's excitement. Bethany looked up at him, this man who had rescued her from an unthinkable fate and given her a second chance at happiness. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," she replied truthfully. Thomas gently touched her cheek, his eyes never leaving hers. "I never expected to find you, Bethany, after Sarah died and the war. I thought that part of my life was over. I came out here to be alone, to build something that was just mine." He shook his head slightly, wonder in his expression. "And then there you were, standing on that auction platform in Abilene, looking so brave even when everything was against you. You saved us," Bethany whispered. "No," Thomas said, drawing her closer. "You saved me, you and Joseph. You brought life back to this place to me." When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, then deeper as she responded eagerly. Bethany had never been kissed like this, with such tenderness and passion combined. William's kisses had been perfunctory at best, possessive at worst. But Thomas held her as if she were precious, his hands respectful even in their desire. Later, in the bedroom that was now theirs to share, Thomas was patient and considerate, allowing Bethany to set the pace of their lovemaking. She had feared this part of marriage after her experiences with William, but Thomas showed her that physical love could be beautiful, mutual, and deeply satisfying. As they lay together afterward, Thomas's arm around her and her head on his chest, Bethany felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged with this good, strong man who had come into her life when all seemed lost. "I love you," she said softly, the words coming naturally now that she had recognized the truth of her feelings. Thomas's arm tightened around her, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you too, Bethany. You and Joseph both." The summer passed in a golden haze of happiness for the newly formed family. Joseph took his first steps in July, tottering across the main room from Bethany's outstretched arms to Thomas's, collapsing against his stepfather's chest with a triumphant giggle. His first real word, unsurprisingly, was "Ma," but his second was "Tom," which he pronounced with such enthusiasm that Thomas couldn't stop grinning for the rest of the day. The ranch prospered under Thomas's careful management, and with the extra money, he bought Bethany a piano, a small upright that was delivered all the way from Kansas City. She had mentioned once that she used to play in St. Louis, and Thomas had remembered. The joy on her face when the instrument arrived made all the expense and trouble worthwhile. In the evenings, after Joseph was asleep in his new room, which he had finally transitioned to at 9 months, Bethany would play while Thomas sat nearby, sometimes rating, sometimes just watching her fingers move over the keys. Often, she would feel his gaze on her and look up to find him observing her with a warmth that still made her blush. They were not without challenges. Thomas sometimes woke in the night, troubled by dreams of the war that he still wouldn't discuss in detail. Bethany learned to hold him through these episodes, murmuring reassurances until he relaxed back into sleep. And there were days when the memory of her first marriage cast a shadow over her happiness, making her withdraw briefly into herself. On those occasions, Thomas gave her the space she needed while making it clear that he was there when she was ready to talk. In September, almost exactly 6 months after her arrival at the ranch, Bethany discovered she was expecting another child. She had suspected for a few weeks, but wanted to be certain before sharing the news with Thomas. One evening, after Joseph had been put to bed, she joined Thomas on the porch where he sat enjoying the cooling air after a hot day of work. She sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "I have something to tell you," she said, her heart full. Thomas turned to her, immediately attentive. "What is it?" "We're going to have a baby," Bethany said, watching his face carefully. "Next spring, I think." For a moment Thomas seemed frozen, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, not his usual reserved smile, but one of pure, uncomplicated joy. "A baby," he repeated. "Our baby." "Yes," Bethany confirmed, relieved by his reaction. "Our baby." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "Are you happy about this?" he asked against her hair. "Very happy," she assured him, "though I admit I'm a bit nervous about having 2 little ones to care for." "You won't be alone," Thomas promised. "I'll be right beside you every step of the way." Bethany believed him completely. Unlike William, who had treated her pregnancy as an inconvenience and burden, Thomas already looked at her with increased tenderness, as if she were even more precious now that she carried their child. The news of the pregnancy was received with delight by the Ortegas. Mrs. Ortega immediately began knitting baby clothes, while Miguel set to work on a second cradle, even more elaborate than the one he had made for Joseph. As Bethany's body changed with the advancing pregnancy, Thomas was attentive and protective without being smothering. He made sure she rested when needed but never treated her as an invalid. They continued to share their bed, Thomas's desire for her undiminished by her changing shape. If anything, he seemed to find her more beautiful, telling her so with both words and touches. Joseph, now a sturdy toddler of 14 months, was oblivious to the coming change in the family dynamics. He spent his days tottering after Miguel in the barnyard, feeding chickens under Mrs. Ortega's supervision, or helping Bethany in the kitchen. His vocabulary expanded daily, and his laughter filled the house with a joy that Bethany had once thought lost to her forever. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in late October. Thomas hired 2 new hands to replace Pete and to help with the increased workload. Both were reliable men with good references, and they quickly became part of the ranch's extended family. They lived in the bunkhouse, but took their meals in the main house, adding to the lively atmosphere at mealtimes. Christmas was a festive affair, with the house decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. Thomas presented Joseph with the carved horse he had been working on for months, now perfectly sanded and painted with remarkable detail. The toddler was entranced, carrying it everywhere and refusing to be parted from it even at bedtime. For Bethany, Thomas had a more precious gift, a locket containing a small portrait of Joseph that he had commissioned during a trip to Wichita. It was silver, delicately engraved with her initials. "It's beautiful," she said as he fastened it around her neck. "But when did you have time to get Joseph's portrait done?" Thomas looked slightly abashed. "Remember when Miguel took him to town for that new shirt back in November? They made a little detour to the photographer's studio." "You schemer," Bethany laughed, touching the locket that now rested against her collarbone. "Thank you. It's perfect." She had gifts for Thomas too, a new leather-bound journal to replace his worn one and a hand-knitted scarf in a deep blue that matched his eyes. But her real gift was one she hadn't planned. "I've been thinking," she said as they sat before the fire after Joseph had gone to bed, "about names for the baby." Thomas looked up from examining his new journal. "Oh, do you have some in mind?" "If it's a girl," Bethany said carefully, "I'd like to name her Sarah, after your sister." Thomas went very still, his eyes fixed on her face. "Bethany," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "We don't have to," she said quickly. "It was just a thought." "No," he said, reaching for her hand. "I'd be honored, truly." He swallowed hard. "And if it's a boy, I thought perhaps James, after my father," Bethany suggested, "but I'm open to other ideas." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "James is a good name, strong. James Thomas Zachary." "Yes," Bethany agreed, loving the way it sounded. "And for a girl, Sarah Bethany Zachary." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands linked, watching the fire dance in the hearth. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the ranch in pristine white, while inside, warmth and love surrounded them. "I never imagined I could be this happy," Thomas said eventually, his voice low. "After the war, after losing Sarah and her baby, I thought that part of my life was over. I came out here to be alone, to build something that was just mine." His eyes, when they met hers, were filled with wonder. "And then there you were, on an auction platform in Abilene," Bethany said with a small smile, remembering his words from their wedding night. "Looking so brave," Thomas continued, squeezing her hand. "Holding your son like he was the most precious thing in the world." "He was," Bethany said simply. "He is, as is this one." She placed her free hand on her rounded belly, feeling a flutter of movement beneath her palm. Thomas moved to kneel beside her chair, placing his hand over hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "for giving me a family. For trusting me with your heart, for making this house a home." Bethany leaned down to kiss him, her own eyes damp. "Thank you for saving us that day, for giving us a chance at happiness." The baby, as if sensing the emotional moment, gave a particularly energetic kick that they both felt. Thomas laughed, the joy on his face making him look younger than his 32 years. "Strong like his mama," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to Bethany's belly. "Or stubborn like his papa," Bethany countered with a smile. On a clear, cold morning in early March, with snow still covering the ground but the first hints of spring in the air, Sarah Bethany Zachary made her entrance into the world. The labor was long but uncomplicated, with Mrs. Ortega serving as midwife and Thomas pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door, Joseph having been taken to the Ortega's cabin to be out of the way. When the first cry pierced the air, Thomas burst into the room, propriety forgotten in his concern for his wife and child. He found Bethany exhausted but radiant, propped up against pillows with a tiny red-faced bundle in her arms. "We have a daughter," she said, her voice weak but joyful. "Come meet Sarah." Thomas approached the bed with reverence, his eyes fixed on the small, perfect face of his daughter. Mrs. Ortega discreetly left the room, closing the door behind her to give the new family privacy. "She's beautiful," Thomas whispered, perching carefully on the edge of the bed. "Just like her mother." Bethany smiled tiredly. "Would you like to hold her?" Thomas hesitated, suddenly looking uncertain. "I've never held a newborn before." "It's easy," Bethany assured him. "Just support her head." "Yes, like that." "Perfect." As Thomas cradled his daughter in his arms for the first time, a look of pure awe transformed his features. Sarah yawned, her tiny fists waving in the air, and Thomas was lost. Bethany watched, her heart overflowing with love for both of them. "Hello, Sarah," Thomas said softly. "I'm your papa. I've been waiting a long time to meet you." His voice caught and he cleared his throat. "Your aunt would have loved you so much." Bethany reached out to touch his arm, understanding the bittersweet nature of the moment for him. "She's watching over us," she said gently, "over her namesake." Thomas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he looked up at Bethany, there were tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he managed. "For everything. For this perfect little girl, for Joseph, for loving me." "Always," Bethany promised, her own eyes filling with tears of happiness. "For always, Thomas." Later that day, when Bethany had rested, Miguel brought Joseph to meet his baby sister. The toddler approached the bed cautiously, his eyes wide as he peered at the small bundle in his mother's arms. "Joseph, this is Sarah," Bethany said, keeping her voice light and cheerful. "She's your sister." Joseph stared at the baby with intense concentration. Then, to everyone's surprise, he reached out and very gently patted Sarah's head. "Baby," he said solemnly. "That's right," Thomas confirmed, lifting Joseph onto the bed for a better look. "Your baby sister, you're a big brother now." Joseph seemed to consider this information seriously. Then he pointed at Sarah and declared, "My baby." Thomas and Bethany exchanged amused glances. "Yes," Bethany agreed. "Your baby sister, you'll help us take care of her, won't you?" Joseph nodded, his expression determined. "Help." Thomas ruffled his stepson's hair affectionately. "That's my boy." The scene was one that would stay with Bethany forever, her family together for the first time. Thomas sitting beside her on the bed, one arm around her shoulders. Joseph settled between them, leaning forward to examine his new sister with curious eyes. And Sarah, tiny and perfect, oblivious to the love surrounding her but already securely wrapped in its embrace. 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the ranch yard as Bethany hung laundry on the line, humming a tune from her childhood. The ranch had grown considerably in the 5 years since Sarah's birth. More land added, more cattle, a new barn to replace the one struck by lightning 2 summers ago. The house, too, had been expanded, with 2 more bedrooms added as the family grew. From the corral came the sound of laughter. Bethany paused in her work to watch as Thomas led a small pony in a circle. 6-year-old Joseph perched proudly on its back. The boy had his father's dark hair but Bethany's green eyes and a smile that could charm birds from the trees. "Look, Mama," Joseph called, waving enthusiastically. I'm riding all by myself. I see that, Bethany called back, smiling at his exaggeration. Thomas was clearly holding both the pony's lead rope and Joseph's leg to keep him secure, but the boy's pride was too delightful to correct. Sarah sat on the bottom rail of the corral fence, her blonde curls bouncing as she clapped for her brother. At 5, she was already showing signs of Thomas's quiet determination and Bethany's quick mind. Behind her stood Miguel, making sure she didn't fall while also cheering Joseph's riding skills. "Bethany," Mrs. Ortega's voice came from the house. "The bread is ready to come out." "Coming," Bethany called back, hanging the last sheet on the line. As she turned toward the house, she felt a small hand tug at her skirt. 3-year-old James looked up at her with solemn blue eyes, Thomas's eyes. "Help Mama?" he asked, his arms outstretched. Bethany smiled, lifting her youngest son onto her hip. "Yes, you can help me with the bread. But remember, the oven is hot." James nodded seriously. "Hot. No touch." They entered the kitchen, where Mrs. Ortega was supervising 1-year-old Abigail's attempts to stack wooden blocks on the floor. The youngest Zachary had been a surprise. Bethany had thought her family complete with 3 children, but a welcome one. She had Thomas's dark hair and a tendency to giggle at everything her siblings did. "Just in time," Mrs. Ortega said, handing Bethany a pair of thick cloths. "Those loaves are perfect." Bethany set James down next to his baby sister and went to retrieve the bread from the oven. The rich, yeasty smell filled the kitchen, making her stomach growl despite the morning's substantial breakfast. As she placed the loaves on the windowsill to cool, Bethany looked out at the scene before her: Thomas and Joseph with the pony, Sarah watching admiringly, Miguel keeping a watchful eye on them all. Inside, James was now helping Mrs. Ortega with the lunch preparations, while Abigail continued her architectural experiments with the blocks. The sight of her family, this beautiful, unexpected family that had grown from tragedy and chance, filled Bethany with a gratitude so profound, it brought tears to her eyes. If Thomas hadn't ridden into Abilene that day, if he hadn't been moved by the sight of a widow and her baby being auctioned off like cattle, where would she and Joseph be now? The thought was too painful to contemplate. The door opened and Thomas entered, carrying Sarah on his shoulders while Joseph danced around them, still excited from his riding lesson. "Mama, did you see me? I rode a whole lap all by myself," Joseph exclaimed. "You were very brave," Bethany assured him, wiping her hands on her apron. "A real cowboy." "Just like Papa," Joseph said proudly, looking up at Thomas with adoration. Thomas lifted Sarah down from his shoulders, his expression soft as he looked at Bethany. Even after 5 years of marriage, the love in his eyes when he gazed at her still made her heart skip. "Everything all right?" he asked, noticing the sheen of tears in her eyes. Bethany nodded, smiling through the emotion that had overtaken her. "Everything is perfect." Thomas crossed the room to her, the children momentarily distracted by Mrs. Ortega offering them slices of apple. He wrapped his arms around Bethany's waist, drawing her close. "What were you thinking about just now?" he asked quietly. "You had that far-away look." Bethany rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I was thinking about that day in Abilene. About how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't come along." Thomas's arms tightened around her. "I thank God every day that I was there," he said, his voice low, "that I found you and Joseph." "So do I," Bethany whispered, looking up at him. "So do I." Their moment was interrupted by a tug on Thomas's trousers. James stood there, looking up at them with a piece of apple clutched in his small fist. "Papa apple," he announced, offering the slightly squashed fruit to his father. Thomas crouched down, accepting the gift with all the seriousness it deserved. "Thank you, James." "That's very kind of you." James beamed, then turned and toddled back to Mrs. Ortega for more treats. Thomas straightened, smiling as he watched his son go. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life," he admitted. "That all of this," he gestured around the kitchen, encompassing the children, the house, and Bethany herself, "is real." "It's real," Bethany assured him, standing on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. "And it's ours, always." Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Thomas and Bethany sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him in a position that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "Do you ever think about going back?" Thomas asked suddenly. "To St. Louis, I mean, to visit." Bethany considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "My parents are buried there, but St. Louis stopped being home a long time ago." She looked up at him, at the strong profile she knew as well as her own face. "This is home now. Wherever you and the children are." Thomas nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. "I was thinking we might take a trip next spring, show the children a bit more of the world than just Kansas." "I'd like that," Bethany said, pleasantly surprised by the suggestion. "Joseph would love to see a big city, and Sarah is always asking about the places in her storybooks. And we could visit your parents' graves," Thomas added softly. "Pay our respects." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Bethany deeply. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing he would understand all that she meant by those two words. They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, the swing creaking gently as Thomas pushed it with his foot. The night was warm, the air fragrant with summer blossoms and the earthy scent of the plains. "I love you, Thomas Zachary," Bethany said eventually, the words as true now as they had been the first time she'd spoken them. "With all my heart." Thomas turned to face her, cupping her cheek in his calloused palm. In the moonlight, his eyes were dark but filled with the same tenderness that had first drawn her to him. "And I love you, Bethany Zachary," he replied, "more than I ever thought possible." As their lips met in a kiss filled with the comfortable passion of long married lovers, Bethany reflected that sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the greatest blessings. A widow and her baby, auctioned off on a dusty street in Abilene, Kansas. A lonely cowboy who rode up late and said, "I'll take them." A chance encounter that had become the love story of a lifetime.